What's up, guys? Thank you so much for tuning in to this video. Today we're going to be talking about stretching, the why, and the how to do it correctly. Hope you guys are ready for this. But just as a disclaimer, while I am a physician with an active chiropractic license registered in the state of Florida, the topics and advice given hereafter are exactly just that, advice. This is not to replace what your current and active treating physicians are recommending for you. This is not a prescription or care of treatment either. If you have any pre-existing conditions, please consult with your doctor before performing or attempting anything discussed in the presentation, because I don't want you guys to get hurt. The information provided is gathered from the most recent peer-reviewed research and not just an anecdotal hearsay. While my opinions may be expressed throughout, they are based upon supported evidence that is available in public research journals and articles, aka it's free and available to you. All right, so who am I? So I've been running for 18 years. I've run exactly 179 races in my life, 5K or longer in distance, plus 75, give or take a few track events through high school and a couple in college. I got my bachelor's of science in exercise science at BYU, and I graduated in 2014. Then I went to chiropractic school at Palmer College of Chiropractic in the Florida campus, where I graduated cum laude. Now, like I said earlier, I'm a licensed chiropractic physician in the state of Florida. A number of years ago, I worked as a sales associate and assistant manager at a running specialty store for a couple of years. And just within the last 6 months or so, I've completed 2 certifications, one through the United Endurance Sports and Coaching Association, where I'm a certified running coach. And I also recently completed my Precision Nutrition Level 1 coaching certification. So today we're going to talk about stretching. We're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about the purpose of stretching and what exactly is it. That's going to lead us into 4 major questions that are all related to stretching. We're going to talk about 4 different types of stretching and what exactly those are. And then we're going to do some demos. I have some videos and some pictures that we'll go over. That'll show you different kinds of stretching, as well as the best way that I've found and what some of the research says in order to stretch the body. And then at the very end, I have a special bonus training for you guys, how to stay loose longer without snapping the rubber band. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So what exactly is the purpose of stretching? Well, this may seem kind of like a pretty simple question, but just so we're all on the same level and we have the same understanding. So the primary reason for stretching is to increase range of motion at the joints. So why do we do this? More range of motion means more mobility, power, and function of the muscles. The more you're able to stretch, then the better flexibility you have, the better and more efficient your body will be able to run, which is pretty important. So it doesn't really matter if we stretch. Well, the purported benefits of stretching, or lack thereof, have recently become hot topics for debate within the realms of fitness and sports performance. The focus of these debates includes these 4 questions. So number 1, does stretching prior to exercise increase, decrease, or have no effect on athletic performance? Number 2, does stretching prevent injury? Number 3, do individuals need to warm up prior to stretching? And number 4, how long should a stretch be held and how often should stretching be done? So I've personally had questions or thought about these questions, each one of them in my running career. And I think a lot of other people, I think it's safe to say a lot of other people have also had these questions. You know, in other Facebook groups, I see people post, well, you know, I have to get my stretching in before, you know, I do whatever. Or I have to stretch afterwards, otherwise, you know, this, and this. So we're going to talk about if there's really any, you know, facts to that, or if it's all just kind of, well, this is what I've always done, so I'm just going to always do it because this works for me. So we're going to dive into the science behind it and kind of talk about it. But the generally accepted principle behind stretching is that when a muscle is stretched, muscle neuron activity decreases, thereby relaxing the muscle, which allows greater range of motion because of the reduced resistance. For this reason, it is theorized that pre-stretching a muscle decreases the force production of a muscle while running. But in contrast, a 2013 study found that utilizing a foam roller prior to exercise can increase range of motion without a decrease in force production. So what does all of that really mean? Well, most of the studies were done measuring sprinters' power instead of distance runners' power. And because sprinters generally produce more force than distance runners, it can be theorized that pre-stretching is not as much of an issue for endurance sports as it would be for sports that predominantly require short maximal efforts, you know, such as sprinting. So when you see sprinters in the blocks jumping up and down, you know, as high as they can, doing their little, you know, their pre-race routine, that's more of a placebo effect or more of a psychological boost rather than a physical one based on research. All right, so I know there's a lot on this slide, but I wanted to make sure I included the science behind all of it. So if you're watching this and you want to actually read, what exactly is going on, just hit the pause button. That way you could read through this. There's some pretty good stuff in there. All right, so let's keep going. So there's 4 types of stretching. There's something called static stretching, dynamic stretching, ballistic stretching, and then something called proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, which has a lot of words all at once. You could call it PNF stretching for short. So static stretching, meaning steady or not moving. So this is when an individual performs and holds a stretch at the end of range of motion. So for example, when you bend over and try and touch your toes and hold it there, that's an example of static stretching. The second is what's called dynamic. So dynamic meaning moving, meaning the person is moving a body part at a controlled speed through a range of motion that mimics the motion performed while running. So in this example, when you're doing high knees or skipping or butt kicks, those are simulating movements within the running gait, and that would be a form of dynamic stretching. Number 3 is what's called ballistic. So ballistic makes you think explosive, so think powerful or sudden. So similar to a dynamic stretch, but the movement is done with momentum with the goal to stretch past the current range of motion limit. So basically what that means is when you're trying to bend down and touch your toes, rather than just slowly creep down, if you bounce or force yourself down to try and go beyond where that limit is, that would be an example of ballistic stretching. And then last is PNF stretching, and this is really good stuff, and you'll see why in a second. So now that we know the difference between the 4 different types of stretching, here is a few pictures of my favorite almost 4-year-old and myself showing what each one really is. So you have static stretching, which we kind of talked about, where you bend over, touch your toes, or you reach up high. So static meaning you're not moving. Dynamic, which simulates some sort of movement. In our case, skipping or high knees, that is similar to the gait cycle. And then, of course, ballistic stretching, where I am being stretched beyond the limits of my muscles, thanks to my favorite little child. Well, I guess I really shouldn't say my favorite little child. I should say my favorite little daughter. So as a stretching kind of rule of thumb, if you aren't sure how to stretch a specific muscle, take that muscle through the ranges of motion it's designed to move in. So think about that for a second. So for example, if your head and neck can flex forward, it extends back, it rotates side to side, and laterally bends in each direction. So each one of those movements stretches a different group of muscles. So what's cool about the human body is this pattern goes through the whole body. So you can do this anywhere in the body, as long as you remember and think about which direction you're trying to move, stretch the opposite direction. So think about it this way. So your hamstrings are involved in knee flexion. So if you want to stretch your hamstrings, you want to move in the opposite direction. So you want to extend your hamstrings. Another example would be if your biceps. So biceps are involved with elbow flexion. If you want to stretch your biceps, you do elbow extension. So kind of think of what movement you want to do and then do the opposite, and that's how you stretch it. I know that seems really like, well, duh, but just kind of remember that through the whole body. So now we got the basics down, we're going to do some demos. So up first, we're going to do the neck region, or what's called the cervical region. And now that we got the neck down, we're going to talk about the mid-back. So now that we got the neck and mid back down, we're going to talk about the low back or the lumbar spine. So as a chiropractor, I see a lot of people who have low back pain or lumbar pain, and these are some of the best stretches that I recommend my patients to do. Next, we have the shoulders. So the shoulders can get a little complicated just because there's so many moving parts. But we're going to talk about three different areas. We're going to talk about the deltoid muscles. We're going to talk about your rotator cuff muscles, and there's four of those. And we're going to talk about your upper traps. So next are the hips. So the hips are kind of like the shoulders. They can get a little complicated just because there's so many moving parts. There's muscles and ligaments and all kinds of things that have to function properly for you to be able to move. So we're going to talk about the four different regions of the hips. We're going to talk about your hip flexors, which are in front. We're going to talk about your adductors or your adductors, which are on the sides. We're going to talk about your abductors, your abductors, which is your inner legs, kind of like your groin area. And we're going to talk about your hip extensors, which is the back, so like your glutes and upper hamstrings. And to continue on from the hips, we're going to talk about the hamstrings and calf muscles. And lastly, we're going to talk about how to stay looser longer, special bonus training. So you want to grab a buddy for this. It's a little easier to have someone that can take you through these ranges of motion than stretching. So we're going to do two things. We're going to talk about PNF stretching, which is what we discussed earlier on in the presentation, one of the 4 types of stretching. And then we're going to talk about something called a pin and stretch. So a pin and stretch is a form of active release, which is really good to help muscles kind of stretch and extend beyond where there's some limitations. So all this will make sense once we dive into these videos. So we're going to talk about 5 different areas. So these are 5 areas that I see quite frequently. So we're going to talk about the neck, we're going to talk about the rotator cuff, hamstrings, the calf muscle, and your tibialis anterior. So when you get those shin splints in the front of your leg, this is really good because this will help you break up those shin splints and get you feeling a little bit better. So up first we have cervical PNF stretching. So what I like to do first is kind of feel around in the upper back, lower neck area. I like to check range of motion, check for rotation, lateral flexion. Once I figure out what areas need a little bit of help, I position the neck by bending forward and turning slightly. I place one hand on the shoulder, the other hand on the back of the head, and the hand that is on the back of the head, he'll actually be pushing against that hand. He'll be pushing for about 4 to 5 seconds, and we'll do that 4 to 5 times, each time pushing a little bit further. One of the things to remember is you want to do this on both sides. So up next we have the rotator cuff. So in this video I point out the 4 different muscles of the rotator cuff. You have your supra and infraspinatus, your teres minor, and your subscapularis, which is deep to all those muscles. So what I like to do first is I'll find the supraspinatus, which sits on top of the little bony part in your shoulder. And so what I'll do is with one hand I'll pin that muscle, kind of using my thumb, and then the person's arm is going to come up to the side and then go all the way across the body. So while they bring it across the body, I'm pushing into their shoulder, which will pin that muscle. And as they move that arm across the body, they'll feel some resistance there. So you can do this for the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor. And in the next video, I'll show you how to focus on the subscapularis, which, like I said earlier, is a little bit deeper into all this. So up next is the subscapularis. So this is the 4th muscle in the rotator cuff. So what I like to have the patients or people do is lay face up, and with my thumb I pin kind of deep into the armpit. So sometimes they may be ticklish there. Usually this is very, very tender. So what I'll do is I'll pin that muscle down and then take their arm through flexion, as you can see in this clip. Alright, so next we have the hamstrings. So the most important thing to remember with the hamstrings is to keep both legs as flat and level as possible. You don't want any bending of the legs at all, especially at the knees. So what you want to do first is have your partner kind of test and see where the tightness begins. So what I'll do is I'll raise the leg up, kind of start to feel where it gets really tight, and I'll look for a verbal cue. Usually the patient or person will be like, okay, that's too far. So once you hit that point, you bring the leg back down just a little bit, and while supporting the leg, you'll have the person push against you, trying to bring their leg down towards the table. You're going to do this a few times, and each time you want to go a little bit further. So you notice in his left leg, I found where that tightness was, I positioned myself, get it ready, and he begins to push. We're going to do that 2 or 3 times, and each time going a little bit further, you'll start to see that his range of motion actually increases. So most important part about this is make sure you keep the legs flat and do it bilaterally. Alright, so the last 2 things we're going to talk about are the lower leg and the tibialis anterior. So with the lower leg, especially in this clip, I'm emphasizing if someone has pain in the foot and or the calf muscle. So what I'll have them do is I'll put resistance to their foot and have them push like they're trying to point their toes against my hand. What this will do is actually activate the calf muscle and some of the anterior leg muscles as well. So tibialis anterior. So this muscle is one of the most common muscles to get injured when people have shin splints. So what I like to do is find the tender spots along that shin bone. In this case, on his right leg, I'll feel to the outside, so his right side, and I'll find those tender spots, and I'll pin and hold them, and then take his foot through flexion, or dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So you notice me point his toes up and then point his toes back down. And that's it, guys. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. Be sure to smash that heart button, give this some love so everyone can find it. And then my special homework assignment for you guys is to comment below one thing you're going to take from this training and implement today. I'm all about action, so don't just think, oh, wow, this is great, or, oh, yeah, I'm going to do these things. Pick one thing and make sure you do it today and share that with everyone, because you never know, maybe someone else is going to do the same thing that you're going to do. And if you haven't yet, go to Instagram and follow the Running Secrets Instagram account. There's a ton of additional tips and things in there to help you guys with your running. And stay tuned for later this week as we cover the next topic.